Hi everyone, thank you for joining us and welcome to Environmental Health Australia's first ever live chat event to celebrate World Environmental Health Day 2020. For those of you who are unsure about what environmental health is, simply put, environmental health focuses on a person's health dependent upon their environment. Environmental health officers, often employed by local council and state government agencies, protect their communities from environmental concerns like food safety, noise pollution, air quality, and stopping the disease transmission rate, and so much more. We're excited to announce that this year's theme for World Environmental Health Day is Environmental Health, a key public health intervention in disease pandemic prevention. And we know why this is the theme for this year's World Environmental Health Day, considering the events that we have all lived through. Environmental health has a crucial role to play during a pandemic, and environmental health officers have been at the forefront of the COVID response efforts from the very beginning by assisting contact tracing, helping law enforcement officers, and educating businesses on how to stop the spread of disease, and so many more things, including being liaison officers in control centres. Today, we are hearing from some fantastic environmental health professionals, and we will open up questions 5 minutes after each speaker. To ask a speaker a question, simply type the comment below, and you're welcome to comment at any time during the talk, and we will make sure that your questions are answered at the end of the presentation. I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, all the way from Washington, DC in America. It's Dr. David Dyjack, and he's the Chief Executive Officer for the National Environmental Health Association. Dr. Dyjack is passionate about environmental health and is a friend of Environmental Health Australia and also Australia, and I'd like to call him my personal friend also. Dr. Dyjack, I have the pleasure of inviting you to our chat today, and we welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and I trust everyone can hear me. $200,000 Americans have died of COVID-19. Reputable economists say that, or project, that we will have close to $500 billion US shortfall in local and state budgets in the United States, beginning with the fiscal year 2021, which in the US starts on October the 1st or next week. 40% of all restaurants in the United States have either closed or are in the process of closing because of COVID-19. And that the data I provided to you does not describe the personal turmoil that many people are going through at this time, and all kinds of sectors have been affected, but also the recreational sector. And it was that sector where I found myself a few weeks ago. On the western shore of Florida, there is a county called Lee County. It sits on the beautiful Gulf of Mexico, and the water temperature there several weeks ago was 31 degrees centigrade. It was beautiful. But for those of you that are sailors, you know what the lee shore is. The lee shore does not only represent Lee County, Florida, but it also represents the way the wind blows towards shore. And these areas of off-island sailing represent danger because in case of a strong wind, we can be blown on shore or onto the coral reef or onto the rocks. And it is this dichotomy, this double entendre of the lee shore that I'd like to kind of discuss with you today. These are the best of times and the worst of times in many respects. My association, the National Environmental Health Association, is your counterpart to EHA in the United States. We have almost 7,000 members. We do a lot of training and education. We have a journal. We manage credentials. We have an annual conference like you, and I've been delighted to speak on 2 different occasions. And Helen, it was great to see you last year. We have 43 affiliated associations around the US, and increasingly we are the voice of environmental health in the country by our presence in Washington, D.C., not far from where I sit this evening. One thing that is very useful to understand about environmental health in the US as we begin to unpack the COVID story is that environmental health and its services are profoundly local. As you see on the slide, the tan color is a decentralized entity or jurisdiction within the United States. What that means is environmental health is regulated and administered at the local level. If you look at California on the left-hand side of the slide, a state of 40 million people, which I think is more than your entire country, there are 62 jurisdictions that environmental health is regulated in. Each of those 62 jurisdictions have their own approaches to environmental health, and in many cases, to public health. So when you think about the US and you ask about the public health system or the environmental health system, honestly, there is no direct answer to what that looks like. There are centralized states where there's a command and control structure, like in Florida, in the bottom right-hand side of your slide, where everyone works off the same statutes and regulations. And then there are mixed model states. My aim is to suggest to you that the reason we're struggling with COVID in the US, and we are, is partially because of the way that we administer environmental health services. We conducted a COVID-19 environmental health workforce assessment this summer in July, July and August. It was a national convenience sample that was digitally distributed. We had about 25 quantitative and qualitative questions, and we received 765 responses. You can see the table on the right that the lion's share of the respondents came from the local level. Remember, environmental health is profoundly local. What I want to demonstrate to you here is that size matters. And in this case, what we know in the United States is that most health departments are pretty small. Now, of course, I'm not talking about LA. I'm not talking about Seattle or Miami or New York or Chicago. I'm not talking about those places. But the irony is most of the United States is in the places between those mega cities. And about 50% of our respondents, as you can see from the table, came from environmental health programs that had between 1 and 10 employees. Actually, that's pretty normal. New York and LA are not the norm. They do get a lot of attention, but when we think about environmental health, we need to think about local environmental health programs that have very small staffs. Our workforce in the US matter. And what I've done, our survey was complete at the end of August. I have some preliminary results to share with you, and these are very preliminary. As you can see, we asked people if they were involved, environmental health professionals, if they were involved in policy-making decisions. And the answer at about a 48% response rate was yes. I don't know about you, but when I went to school, I never had a class on policy development and implementation. All of my courses, both at the master's and doctoral level, were in science. And so there is a mismatch right now in the US between what people are being asked to do and what they're trained to do. Look at the bottom of the table. We asked people if they're involved in public relations and communication. 63% of the respondents said that this was a primary function for them. I don't know about Australia, but in the US, we don't provide environmental health professionals entire courses on communication. And I hope you're beginning to see that these are very small health departments, primarily manned by environmental health professionals that frankly are probably not well suited or trained or prepared to be involved in the activities related to COVID. Your interpersonal skills matter a lot. Over 50% of our constituents were involved in contact tracing. And you know, there's both a skill and an art to contact tracing. I know that many of you are involved in that, and I thank you for that. But there is a lot of interpersonal connectivity, skill sets that are required to do that effectively. As I close out my prepared comments, here is a slide that really clings to me like a leech. Look at the top question around crowd dispersal. About 7% of our constituents are acting essentially as law enforcement because they go out to places where people are not following face covering recommendations, or there's large crowds that are gathering, and they are asked to disperse those crowds. I don't know about you, I never had a class or a lecture or even a conversation about how to disperse crowds. And then logistics. I understand logistics, how to get stuff from one place to another. I understand it intuitively, but about a third of our members that responded to the survey suggested that they are actively involved in logistics. And so this is something else for us to consider. So what do we do now? What I know is this: a lot of people have died. Our workforce is highly stressed. It is being asked to do things it's not trained to do. And frankly, I'm getting a lot of phone calls from our constituents that are asking for advice and recommendations on how to find a new career. It is really kind of depressing on many, many days. I'm not suggesting it's the majority, but there's quite a few. And what I recommend to my constituents, and what I would recommend to those of you in Australia that share similar concerns, is please dispense with the familiar grooves of your mind. This is a new issue. We need to think differently. We need to act differently. And what I like to say is go where things are going. And we need to be creative and think on our toes and create and deliver value in ways that we didn't consider a year ago. I ask that you remain engaged. I speak with countless people who say they can't read the news. They can't have one more conversation about COVID. I'm not suggesting your fatigue is unreal. It is very real. I'm validating that. But we all need to come over the potential to check out, remain engaged, accomplish what you can. I speak with people every day that are working 12 and 14 hours, including me, by the way. And what I say is you can't solve every problem. Accomplish what you can and find meaning in your work. That's meaning to you, not what your boss says, not what your coworker says, but find meaning in the activities that you're engaged in. Seek out positive relationships. It matters. One bad apple can ruin the barrel. And frankly, live for ideas, not off of ideas. Your obligation is to create and generate new ways of thinking to help us accommodate this new normal at this time, and to be somebody who tenders solution and doesn't become, as Helen is, remember I mentioned in Adelaide last year, don't become a BMW, somebody who bitches and moans and whines about everything. Your role and responsibility is to generate new ideas, generate new solutions, and to help keep us all connected in a very positive way. As I close, I'd like to say NEHA, as part of its solution around training, is providing 12 contact hours of free continuing professional education. Anybody can access it. It'll be online for the next 5 months at the link provided at the bottom of this slide. So as we think about the Lee Shore, as we think about recreating in Lee County, Florida, we have both the best and the worst of both worlds. This is our moment to shine, and shine on, I think we should. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for sharing some staggering information with us, David, about the state of affairs in the USA. We do think of you as our brothers and sisters in the workforce in America, and we have all watched the news, and we do see what's going on, and we are there with you. We do agree too that the workforce wasn't prepared for this event. However, I also agree with you that it is our time to shine. We are EHOs and we are best placed to deal with what is happening. And thank you for giving us the encouragement to keep going in this space and not be BMWs.
Okay.
like to open up for questions, please. So we'll get some. Is there some questions up from the audience?
Helen, there has been some questions about the slides. Anyone is welcome to the slides. They can email me if they would like me to send them directly. Otherwise, I think EHA will be providing those. So one of the question is, can you dig deeper into your concluding recommendation to live for ideas and not off of them? Listen, when we all think the same, none of us thinks very much. When we all think the same, none of us thinks very much. And I think we need to get up in the balconies of our mind every so often through these long, stressful days. And trust me, there's many, many of them. Get up in the balcony of your mind and look down on the people dancing on the floor beneath you, or hypothetically, your coworkers, your constituents, and your family, and ask yourself, what is really going on here? And what role do I have in, let's say, the conflict or the struggles that we're having, and be part of the solution? So I encourage everyone, take a step back, take a deep breath, and always look to be solution-oriented. That is a recipe for having a bright career, and people will always thank you for being positive and tendering ideas. Don't anticipate that everyone's going to accept them. For me, I'd say one idea out of 20 sticks, but I just keep throwing them against the wall until we get something that's productive. And so I encourage everyone, find yourself in a position where you can make recommendations.
That's excellent. Thank you, David.
You bet.
David, it's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us on the other side of the world for that effort. And again, know that we are here and know that we think of you often. So we really appreciate you joining us today.
Likewise. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I look forward to a time where we can all meet together in person. Godspeed, everyone.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you.
You bet. Bye.
Excellent, guys. Thank you. So now we'd like to invite Bob Handby, who is also a friend of Environmental Health Australia. And Bob, it was a few years ago now that we also had you speak at a conference in South Australia, and it was very interesting. And it was about the amazing work that you did overseas on many projects, but this specifically around Ebola through the Red Cross. So Bob, I'm really looking forward to your presentation with us today with the live chat, and I'd like to welcome you on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Helen. It's nice to see you again. The question, or the questions that I'm speaking about today is the lessons learned, or any lessons that we might have learned from the Ebola response relevant to the current response to the COVID-19, and start by maybe just talking about some of the similarities between Ebola and COVID-19, and these are not in any particular order, and some people might argue with me, but firstly, I think the thing that's important is to understand they're both very contagious or infectious. I get confused between the word contagious and infectious, but both very, very contagious. There's no specific treatment for them. There's not an antibiotic that people can go on to treat them. The method of controlling both COVID and Ebola is definitely a public health response, not a medical response. It's interesting that we keep talking about a public health response, which is carried out by environmental health officers very often. Both viruses appear to originate from animals. Interesting with the Ebola. The Ebola is endemic in the bat colonies, particularly in Africa. Bats don't die from Ebola, but monkeys eat bats, and monkeys get Ebola, and monkeys die, and people eat monkeys, and so people get Ebola. So they both seem like they come from animals. They do have a different mode of transmission. Clearly, the Ebola is sort of a direct contact through body fluids, and COVID seems to be more airborne, certainly airborne. And probably one of the main differences, fortunately, is that the Ebola has a very high mortality rate. People in Ebola treatment centres were around about a 50% mortality rate, which isn't the case with COVID. So what were the main public health responses to Ebola? And I had these coming up on my screen, which I'll go through them quickly. Certainly you need a, can you still hear me, Helen? Hello?
Yeah, Bob, we're good.
Yeah, still good? Sorry, it's just that I changed the screen and I couldn't see you. The public health response to Ebola, you certainly need laboratory capacity to determine, to confirm whether people have Ebola. But the important part is the contact tracing and surveillance, both for Ebola and for COVID. We call social mobilisation or education extremely important, obviously, and the in Ebola, particularly safe and dignified burials. There were certainly some legislative requirements which are similar to here. And then in addition to that, we needed a lot of psychological support for people working in the area. And the previous speaker sort of alluded to that a little bit about supporting people working in the space. And then at the end of the chain, we have Ebola treatment centres, where here in Australia we have hospitals who are sort of important, but the prevention is certainly far more important. One of the major issues I think that we're facing in Australia, and I still find it incredible in Victoria, are the number of healthcare workers who are becoming infected with COVID-19. It was absolutely a major priority in the Ebola not to have our healthcare workers become infected, knowing that half of them would die if they did become infected. So I think some of the things and the obvious ones are taking universal precautions for both diseases, because we actually don't know initially who's got COVID and who had Ebola. So everyone should be treated as potentially infected. We had in the Ebola, which was critical to our protecting of healthcare workers, but more so the people themselves. We had 3 zones in an Ebola treatment centre. We have a suspect zone, a probable zone, and a confirmed zone. The suspect zone were people who came in who might have had a couple of symptoms, and so they were suspect they may have Ebola, so therefore they go into a particular area. If on further questioning they had some symptoms, but also came from an Ebola, an area where Ebola was known, well, they went from suspect to probable, and then on a blood test they became confirmed. And I don't know a lot about what's happened in our healthcare facilities here, but I'm not sure that we have segregated, particularly in our aged care facilities, potentially those with COVID and those that didn't have. Probably the most critical point that I would make today is the use of PPE and the availability of PPE. It's debated even here in Victoria today whether PPE is adequate and available. It was absolutely critical in the Ebola response to have the correct PPE, but more so the method of putting the PPE on, the training required to put it on properly, but more so important about the supervision of the undressing. So when you were in the hot zone and you came out fully dressed in PPE, you had someone supervising the process of undressing. And I've seen many instances here on the news and on TV and the COVID where people have come out of a healthcare facility, a doctor or a nurse or somebody else, and they're describing how hot it's been in there and how dangerous it's been, and they immediately take their PPE off with their hands, and then they wipe their forehead with their hands because it's so hot, and wiping the sweat away. And I'm thinking if that was Ebola, then half of those people would have died. So we would have paid more attention to it. So I don't think there has been enough work gone into the use of PPE, putting it on and taking it off. And another point that I make, which we are slowly learning here, but very, very slowly, is the payment of casual workers. In the Ebola, any African local people we had working for us, some of them it was the first job they had ever had, and it was absolutely critical for them, the money that they were earning. So here in Australia, we have this casual employment that if people don't go to work, they don't get paid. And we still have instances where people who have got some symptoms who are going to work knowing darn well if they don't turn up, they don't get paid. And we have in Sydney recently a taxi driver that was said to have been infected for 5 or 6 days driving people around. And I'm wondering whether if that taxi driver had stayed home, whether he would have got paid. So payment of casual workers to encourage them to stay home if they were infected was critical. The disposal of bodies was a massive issue in the Ebola because a body became the viral load spiked when someone died. So the no traditional burials which resulted in washing of bodies was allowed. And another interesting thing over in the Ebola, which I'm not sure that we did here, was the swabbing of people when they died, no matter where they died and who they were before they were buried. And I know people, I know of cases in where I live of people who have died in an aged care facility. We don't know what they died from, probably old age, but I'm wondering whether they were actually swabbed before they were buried, because if they did in fact have COVID-19 and they were buried without being swabbed, we would never know, and then there was no contact tracing taking place. So I think, and it was illegal to bury somebody in Sierra Leone, for example. Illegal to bury them before they were swabbed. So, and just finishing off quickly, were the public health measures taken effective? Yes, absolutely effective. And without those public health measures of contact tracing, etc., we would still have Ebola. I did have a screen, and I'm not sure whether you can see the screen, but I had a slide with a graph showing the centre that I was working in, where when we first opened it up, the graph went up with lots and lots of cases of positive for Ebola, and then very quickly that graph dropped down. The positive cases dropped down, and that dropped down because of the public health measures for each of those cases. We went out and did the contact tracing and education. Did environmental health officers play a role in the fight against Ebola? Absolutely. I know of EHOs from New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, who played a major role in infection control in the area of water and sanitation, and were very highly regarded over there working in the Ebola setting. And I think it's interesting that in an area in Sierra Leone where I worked, I took a small team of a guy from Finland, a nurse from Germany, an architect from Spain, and some local people, and I was chosen to be the team leader to take this team into a place called Kono. And my background is environmental health, and it was considered by the experts over there that I had the best overall knowledge to lead that team into what was potentially a very dangerous area. So I think it's a credit to our profession that an Australian EHO was chosen for that role. So that's my message, Helen. And I'm happy to try and answer questions if there are any questions.
Thank you for sharing the similarities between Ebola and COVID. I don't think we've actually thought about it in that perspective, but obviously with your experience, with what you have lived through also, it's great to hear that the environmental health response or the public health response was important in reducing the number of infections in both of these cases. So, we're proud to know that environmental health was recognised in that space. We're going to open up for questions now, and we do have that one. What should be done to protect frontline health workers from COVID-19?
I'm having trouble with my screen. I've got a screen on top of a screen. So the question was, what should we be doing to protect healthcare workers? Was that the question?
That's right, Bob.
Yeah, well, as I alluded to, the absolute protection, as I see it, would be comprehensive use of PPE. And when I say comprehensive, if you see the slides of people working in the Ebola, there was certainly no skin being shown at all, no skin exposed whatsoever. and when you went into the hot zone, and that's certainly not the case being here in COVID. And people will say, oh, well, it's not practical, it's too expensive, it's too this or it's too that. But we've had something like 2,000 healthcare workers contract COVID in Australia. The cost of those people having to go home and isolate, plus all their contacts isolate, would be far greater than having complete sets of PPE and supervising the putting on and taking off. So I think the PPE that we have used is inadequate, and I think the training about putting it on and more importantly taking it off has been completely inadequate. And even, this has been going on now for 6 months or so in Australia, and I don't see that we have improved in that area. So education around the use of PPE is critical, and maybe within the healthcare, and I'm not working in a hospital, so I don't know exactly what happens there, but the isolation, having like in the Ebola, we had we had the suspect, the probable and the confirmed, and I think that there's probably some work that could be done here to make sure that we're segregating potential COVID cases with non-potential ones. I think the other thing that I haven't heard about in Australia with COVID, maybe the figures are out there. I'd be interested to know as to how many people are asymptomatic with COVID. We hear about the positive tests, but how many of those people are symptomatic and how many are unsymptomatic, not symptomatic, because that's where your universal precautions kick in and are very important.
Fantastic. I've just been writing your thoughts down, Bob, because I'm going to take that back with me too. Definitely the use of PPE, is super important. So, Bob, that's it for the questions. That was really interesting, actually, to hear the similarities between those Ebola and COVID. So thank you for sharing your personal experiences with us. And I'm sure that we will be in touch again soon. So thank you for your time today, Bob, and for joining us today.
You're welcome, Helen. Can you just tell me, did people have access to the PowerPoint presentation or not?
We did get there in the end. So,
okay.
Yeah, we did get up on screen. So thank you very much.
You don't need me to send you that. That's fine.
Thank you.
Well, enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks.
You too. Thanks, Bob.
Bye.
How interesting. Thanks, guys. Up next is our speaker from South Australia, Dr. Kirstin Ross, who works at Flinders University. Dr. Ross lives and breathes environmental health, and she is responsible for training the majority of EHOs in South Australia, not to mention some interstate and overseas as well. So I'm excited to invite Dr. Ross to chat with us today and welcome you on board. Thank you, Kirstin.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Helen. Can everybody see or hear me? Yep. Okay, terrific. So before I start, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connection with land, sea and community. Also, I acknowledge the fact that Helen has one day holiday before she starts her new job, and she's using her one-day holiday to do this, which is amazing. And then thirdly, what Bob just had to say was amazing. So those lessons that we can learn from Ebola, I think, are really interesting and really lead into the lessons that we can learn from other countries. And I'll definitely have to catch up with him and find out more, because that was just an amazing talk. So thanks, Bob, heaps. So my talk is about lessons learned from around the world. And how do I go on to the next one? Yeah. So at the start of COVID-19, we were in the university were changing the way we did everything. So we were delivering fully online. We couldn't run labs. Everyone else was going through massive changes as well. But I thought it would be a nice opportunity to talk to my academic friends around the world. So all the other people who are delivering environmental health courses. And I knew a few of them from the UK and the US through conferences. But so I sent out an email just to the few that I knew and asked whether they'd be willing to join a Zoom meeting, and also whether they'd be willing to share the Zoom meeting invitation with other academics that they knew. And very quickly, we formed a group of academics from the UK, from the US, Portugal and Thailand. So a very sort of eclectic group. We now meet every fortnight, and this is still going on. And to be honest, I think we'll probably continue to meet forever. I hope so. It's been a really great experience. And we share ideas about teaching and learning and so on, but we've also been looking at some of the things that different countries are doing in response to coronavirus. And so I thought I'd share some of those ideas with you now. And I've divided them up into cool things. So cool thing number one, in Wales, what they did was they linked an environmental health officer, so an individual environmental health officer, with every aged care centre. And what that did was a number of things. It really reinforced the idea that environmental health officers are infection control experts. So we have a thorough understanding of how to control infection around both touch surfaces and so on, but also around things like food safety. And it also gave a clear link for each individual aged care centre to be able to ask questions. And so I think that was one of the really sort of cool things that I came across. Cool thing number two, in the UK, one of the lecturers was able to get a radio stint every day for between 5 and 10 minutes, where the general public could ring in and ask questions about the coronavirus, but specifically being answered by an environmental health person or an environmental health lecturer. Now, the reason I've included that as a cool thing number two is that it really shows clearly that environmental health were being seen as the experts, so with a high level of expertise in terms of the knowledge that they could share and the capacity to respond to all sorts of different questions that the general public might have. Cool thing number three was that we were, one of our group, Matilda Rodriguez, was asked to write a manuscript for a very prestigious journal called Safety Science about what everybody across the world was doing in response to coronavirus. And as a result of that, 4 of us were actually asked to present at the virtual EHA conference, which was really terrific. So what that paper did, and that manuscript is going to be published in the next couple of weeks, and I'll happily distribute that on the Environmental Health Australia website. What that did was really collate in a much more deep way the sorts of things that I'm talking about to you today. So all the cool things are in much more detail in this particular paper. So yeah, the idea then that we were each, the 4 of us, so someone from Wales, someone from England, someone from Portugal, and me, were then able to present to this virtual EHA conference a couple of weeks ago, and respond to questions from Americans around these sorts of things that I'm talking to you about. So I guess really the point here is that there were these ongoing or expanding connections. So it was almost like we formed this little group, and then the connections increased exponentially as more of us got together. Cool thing number 4 was because we were engaged consistently with Dr. David Dyjack and his team from EHA through our environmental health across the world meetings, we were able then to see what they were creating what resources they were creating for their members, for EHA members. And particularly important was a couple of resources that they made. And Dr. Dyjack referred earlier to the fact that communication and response to angry people was not necessarily something that people were trained in, and as is policy creation. So a couple of these just-in-time resources are particularly valuable for our teaching and also for other practicing EHOs. One called Clashes, Communications and Coronavirus, and a second one called COVID, Workplace and Employee Health. And these are particularly good because although they're made really with an American audience in mind, all of the things that they deal with are very, very similar to the sorts of things that environmental health officers and also the students that we're teaching are confronting. So they shared them, and then we used them, and I'd highly recommend that you Google Just in Time and EHA and have a look at the resources that have been made available. The other thing that EHA was able to facilitate was a separate research group. We had been granted a small amount of money to look for SARS-CoV-2 in beach sand. And this came about because one of the senators in the US had told people not to go down the beach. So we formed a group with people from Hawaii and other places from our group to go out and actually sample for sand and surf and look for SARS-CoV-2. Another cool thing that was mentioned was that the UK and other countries are doing a lot more of the track and tracing. And the other day, someone was discussing the fact that in the UK particularly, they found that people who were being interviewed about who they had had contact with were far more willing to open up to people with similar accents or people who knew their patch. So, for example, if somebody said that they'd been to a particular pub and the person who was asking the questions knew where that pub was, they were then far more open to really exploring who they'd actually been in contact with. And I think this is one of those areas where environmental health officers know their patch. They know their patch so really well. And it was really, I mean, who would have known? Environmental health officers know what's going on at this incredibly local level. And this has been utilised really extensively in other areas. In some areas in Australia, but I think that acknowledging this understanding of the local area is a really important component that an important component of environmental health officers' knowledge. So Dr. Dyjack has said a number of times that environmental health is profoundly local, and he's absolutely right. So that example that I gave you just on the previous slide about the value of local is definitely true. But I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about this group is that I feel like I'm really embedded now with the global community of environmental health academics. And that for me was particularly important in times like these where you can feel like you're struggling on your own, but actually you're not. You're running into all sorts of people who are doing very similar sorts of things that you are. And I would strongly recommend that you reach out to your own environmental health global community. Environmental Health Australia can help. We are part of a twinning system. But really for me, the important thing was that ongoing regular support. So regular support and chats, great ideas, and then reinforce this idea of support. So support from people who are doing exactly the same things you are under different circumstances in different countries, but with ideas and so on that can help. So that's a bit of an acknowledgement of some of the members of the group. And that's it from me. Does anyone have any questions?
Kirstin, thank you for that chat today. What I'd like to comment on some cool things that you said is that environmental health has a high level of expertise to deal with the response to a pandemic. And for me, that really highlights that it gives us the confidence to actually stand up and be in this space and be noticed and do the job that we love doing. The other cool thing that I'd like to comment on is the collaboration with our neighbours and all across the world that you are participating in. It's really awesome that we can learn together, support each other, and feel like we are part of a wider family, which is the case. That's bringing us closer together during these times. So thank you for sharing that with us. Now, on to questions. Do we have anything for Kirstin? Yes, we do. So you said we could reach out to our overseas colleagues as EHOs. How would we do this?
Well, if any of you know any environmental health officers from any conferences that you've been to, I would suggest contacting them directly. Alternatively, like I said, Environmental Health Australia has a twinning program. And to be honest, I think that the group doesn't need to be particularly large. Our group sort of fluctuates between, sort of maybe 3 or 4 people turning up to about maybe 20 at the biggest meetings, but just reaching out to anybody that you know and establishing a regular meeting using Zoom, which we're all really, really familiar with now, unfortunately. It really provides a way of being able to get to know one another. But yeah, I'm sure Environmental Health Australia can help with this because we are members of IFE, so we have an international body of colleagues.
That's super cool. Thank you. I would also encourage each and every one of us to do the same and reach out to our fellow colleagues as well. I think that's it for today's questions with you, Dr. Ross. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing that with us. It's really interesting to see what everyone else around the world's doing in the same space as us. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Okay, what an exciting morning we've had. So I'm really interested to hear our next speaker. We've got Dr. Greg Whiteley speaking to us about the decontamination of hands and surfaces. This year, the amount of questions that we have had in this space is enormous. And I'm really interested to hear Dr. Whiteley discuss this particular topic with us. Dr. Whiteley, welcome and thank you for your time. And we're keen to hear your chat with us today.
Fantastic. Helen, thank you. And thanks to EHA for allowing us to do this virtual system. It's actually very good. So I'll just go straight to share screen. All right. So I'm going to talk to everyone today about hands and surfaces. This is the very practical end of what's going on with COVID-19. And as Bob actually said earlier on, wearing PPE is one of the great risks of the whole process. And in fact, about a third of the workers who caught Ebola, the healthcare workers who caught Ebola in the West African outbreak, were able to catch it or did catch it actually when they took their PPE off. So it was not just about not wearing it correctly, it was actually about what happened with it. So here's the things, we've now got COVID-19. It's basically spread east to west, north to south. There are several variants of the virus spreading in the community and circulating, even in the Australian community, different variants of the virus. The most infectious variant is known as G614. The initial variant that came to Australia was D614. D614, the initial variant, had what's called an R0 number of about 1.3, so it wasn't all that infectious. Whereas the G614 has an RO somewhere around 6 to 7 times that level. Now, one of the principles of this virus is that what gets touched gets contaminated. Person who has the virus will be shedding the virus prior to showing any symptoms. That's as much as 2 days before onset of symptoms. And some people are super shedders, that is, they're shedding it everywhere. So at an earlier, a particular super spreading event in Australia was a wedding in the Wollongong area of New South Wales, where a single overseas returnee who was pre-symptomatic came to the wedding and hugged and kissed and danced, and everyone had fun, and 38 of 100 guests were contracted to the virus. So that sort of shows you how close, and it's the virus is on someone that's contaminated. They're shedding it regularly. And just as a matter of interest, this is work we published just last year. One of the things we know about microorganisms is that once they're on your skin, and it doesn't matter whether you have gloves or bare hands, and I don't have time to show you all of the data, but this is from a publication in a journal called Infection Control and Hospital Epidemiology. The bugs stay on your skin or hands or gloves for up to 19 subsequent touches. And what's more, if you've got wet hands or wet gloves, they don't come as long, but you shed 10 times the volume of bugs. And the important thing to note here, particularly if you've got PPE, is you'll touch your face 20 to 40 times every hour. We touch our eyes, we scratch our nose, we touch our ears, we might pick at our teeth. But the reality is this virus uses those nascent habits of humans to get from one human to another, from the cells that are excreting the virus from the infected patient onto a surface or a hands, and then the uninfected person touches their hands with the virus on their hands onto a mucosal surface, and immediately you have the risk of cross-contamination. Now, before we deal with the hand hygiene issue, let me say there was a paper literally which we got up on the internet on just on Wednesday this week that showed that in the UK that about the same number of people catch this virus in a densely packed ward as we expected with Ebola. That is about a third of the healthcare workers are going to get this virus in a densely packed ward. And the odds ratio is about 1.6 times that of not having a ward packed with COVID-19 patients. And in that same paper, we found that the virus was on surfaces. It doesn't survive really practically all that long on surfaces, but it will survive inside the aerosolized droplets as long as it stays well hydrated. So the transmission time via a surface is probably not a long time, but the key mitigation is hand hygiene, whether it's under running water or with an alcohol-based hand rub. We don't have time today to deal with all of the issues around ABHRs, but for healthcare workers, and I include all EHOs in that category for this talk, you should definitely be using a TGA-approved antibacterial hand rub. You should not be going to over-the-counter hand rubs at this stage that are generally available, primarily because you have an elevated risk. The hand rubs that are out there that are not TGA approved may be from very good and ethical suppliers. If you're comfortable with the supplier, that's fine. But you just need to be aware that none of the post-market support nor pre-market testing is currently required. And one of the ironies of hand sanitizers, just as a bit of a catch-up for everybody, is that in fact, you are not allowed to make virucidal claims on hand sanitizers. So any hand sanitizer that says it kills COVID-19 is making, in fact, an illegal claim. And the Therapeutic Goods Administration has had a field day taking people off to court for false claims in regard to hand sanitizers and disinfectants. Now, of course, when it comes to using disinfectants, this has been a great opportunity area for the snake oil salesman. And really, we're talking disinfectants, not sterilants. The regulatory framework is set out in TGO 104, that is Therapeutic Goods Order 104. There's a graduated risk, and the microbial performance testing is standardised. That is, you don't do peer review, but you have standardised tests. There's a graded system of label claims. But the important thing about virucidal claims is that every single virucidal claim has to be pre-market approved by the TGA. Now, in terms of killing this virus, it's not a very robust virus. There is a very wide array of raw materials that will work. This is from products listed on List N in the US EPA context. The US EPA has over 350 products on that list. In Australia, we have a separate list. There is a web link that you can use on this PowerPoint slide. And at last count, there were 41 separate products approved by the TGA to kill COVID-19. Now, when you're using disinfectants, the thing we need to remember, of course, is that they're not like an X-ray gun. They are hazardous. There are certain precautions that need to be taken. PPE is needed. You don't need to go over the top and find the most vigorous disinfectant, because that introduces other risks. The illustration I've used is that you don't need a hand grenade when all you need is a fly swat. There's a lot of important data about reading labels, first not last. As EHOs, we forget about sustainability, so disposal of containers and waste liquid is important. There's also issues about allergy. Some people get allergic to disinfectants. And of course, in many cases, those that get allergic, in fact, have been subject to overexposure due to poor ventilation. These are all matters that EHOs should understand and do well. The other thing is that disinfectants don't work under control. You must have direct contact between the disinfectant and the microbe. You've got to give the disinfectants sufficient time. Some disinfectants work very quickly, others take a bit longer, and also you need the right temperature. Now, evidence that doesn't work, spraying wildly with various disinfectants. Here's someone without adequate PPE. They've got the wrong type of mask. They've only got gloves. They've got a lot of uncovered skin, and they're spraying a disinfectant all over chairs and tray tables there on the airplane. As you can see, the first one in the screenshot is in fact not down, but there's no cleaning indicated. And unfortunately, in this market, there's been a lot of snake oil about what can work and what can't, and people dressed up in a whole pile of PPE. Doesn't necessarily work. And part of that's because the first thing that needs to happen is cleaning. This is bread and butter for EHOs. Cleaning is the process of removing unwanted soils and microorganisms. It's the critical first step in any hygienic protocol. And of course, it means that you've got to use PPE because the disinfectants themselves are hazardous. But as soon as you've got gloves and sprays and wipes, you've got potential for contamination. And there's a great risk if it's not handled correctly. Now, the other note about cleaning is we know that it's not actually straightforward. There are at least 9 variables involved in the single act of wiping. So controlling that is really important. And therefore, getting the cleaning system right before the disinfectant is also the most important first step. And the things we need to focus on are not the floors and the windows and maybe all the shiny bits of surfaces. It's the things that people touch, the high touch surfaces and objects. That's what needs to be the focus of our attention. And when you're doing cleaning, there's new rules about cleaning that are going to really start to set the stage, particularly in regard to disposable wipes. Here's some lessons from Professor Millard from the University of Cardiff in Wales, with Professor Satar from the University of Ottawa. Use a cloth only once, use the cloth on only one surface, and use the cloth in only one direction. Now, anyone that's an EHA will pick that up straight away as aseptic cleaning. But it's really important because if you reuse the cloth becomes the fomite, which allows the virus to spread from place to place. So it's very important if you've got COVID positive patients, COVID positive settings, that you apply an aseptic technique to your cleaning processes. Now, one of the problems we do have in this area is how do you measure and validate the cleaning? Can you measure COVID-19 on a surface? Well, no, you can't do it easily. Unfortunately, you need to have PCR. Most people just don't have access to that. The good news is that you can use surrogates because there is good evidence now that using a surrogate like ATP testing, the virus is only usually present in combination with other cellular soils that contain ATP. And so the rapid ATP system, which will detect those cellular soils, are a pretty reasonable analogue. And the second thing is, how can you ensure that the cleaning protocol is COVID safe? Well, here's some simple, again, very typical EHO stuff. Have a clear protocol, use only TGA approved disinfectants, monitor the surface cleanliness, and use an appropriate surrogate tool. And that's all for the talk. And I'm happy to hand back to the moderator for questions.
Thank you, Greg. That was very important information for us as environmental health professionals to be aware of all of those things that you kind of think about using the cloth in certain directions and all those are so important on those high touch surfaces. And as you mentioned, this is the practical end of the COVID response, and PPE and the disinfection and cleaning is really what we need to be focusing on. And thank you so much for those tips and information that we can use moving forward. Now we have some questions for Greg. Okay, here we go. Is there a dose load for infection that you know of?
Great question. In fact, it was covered by an editorial in our local infection journal, Infection, Disease and Health. The editorial was by a very eminent infectious disease physician by the name of Professor Stephanie Dancer, who's a colleague. And she made the point, with this virus, we're really only, 8 months into really knowing about it. And at this stage, no, we don't know what the dose load is. We don't know what the minimum infective dose is. But one thing to note about this virus is that if it's inside a cell and it's just about to bud out from the cell, that one cell could contain 10,000 virions. So cleaning becomes the real issue, and removal of soils, because if you've got a cellular soil, those cells could contain the virus. And if they do contain the virus, there are big numbers in each cell. So although we don't know the base load, we know that a cell is a risk.
Wow, how fascinating. That's why cleaning is so important. Okay, another question. Hi, Greg, can you please provide a link to the research paper on glove contamination?
Yeah, look, what I'll do is I'll put the references up through EHA. It's not open access at this stage, but if you want them, you can ask me and we'll work out how to get it. There's actually 3 references. There's one that was published with respect of ungloved hands, and there's a second series of references with respect to gloved hands. And there's a third reference by Professor Mary Lou McClaws about the frequency of people not using appropriate or sufficient hand hygiene. And they all go pretty well together.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got another one. How should food food businesses complete a deep clean if COVID is detected?
Well, first of all, let me do a deep clean. There's no such term as deep clean. It just drives me insane in the media. What they mean is a thorough clean. So let's just take that term, cleaning. Cleaning is the removal of the unwanted soils and microbes. The most important thing that a restaurant could do is make sure their cleaning systems are working. The use of a disinfectant in addition to that is probably a bit of a safety issue, and certainly important if there has been contamination that's known, that's confirmed. But cleaning is the first step. You really must make sure that the cleaning is done. Don't send the people in with their the full spacesuit. Do the cleaning first. Make sure you've got your good PPE on. Do thorough cleaning. Throw out the used cloths. They should be disposed of in an appropriate manner, and only then move to disinfectant. And that'll apply, by the way, to the crockery, the cutlery. We're actually doing work at the moment with the University of New South Wales. We're actually looking at standard approaches to the food industry. What happens if, the crockery, the cutlery, and everything involved? So we're actually looking at specifically with the surrogate viruses what works in a standard dishwashing approach.
Oh, we look at that. That's great. They're fantastic questions, everyone. And Greg, you've made me realise that I think we need to brush up on our infection control. It is back to basics, but it's definitely things that we need to remember. So thank you for highlighting that for us.
Absolutely, doing the hand hygiene thing.
Practicing what you preach. Thanks, Greg. That was awesome. Well done. And we'll get on to that too.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks very much for that today. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Andrew Mathieson, and he's going to talk to us about the potential future of premises inspection post-COVID-19, which is something that I'm sure as EHOs we are all thinking about the future and what this might look like. So, Andrew, we're very excited to hear your thoughts and comments on this, and welcome to the chat today.
Thanks, Helen. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, thanks so much. I've already shared my screen, so hopefully Sam can do it. So thank you very much to EHA for the invitation to speak. Thanks for Helen for sort of hosting us, and for Sam in the background for doing all the magic. My presentation is really just a little bit of blue sky thinking about how we need to start maybe rethinking what we do with regards to inspections post-COVID. So without further ado, let's have a look. So we're all aware of traditional inspections and what they look like, where we consider the history of compliance of a premises. When we look at the sort of before a visit, we sort of, and during the visit we start to look at to discuss with the operators how they're working, use the inquirer skills we've developed. So we classically do an inspection, an audit, and then we act upon that, or we decide what the appropriate course of action would be. And we can use education, we can use information, we can use penalties if it's appropriate, or we can take to court and look for a fine or some other form of punishment, in a sense, for failing to comply with what we're trying to look at. And then we might revisit, but that doesn't always happen. But in an ideal world, we then revisit at an appropriate time. And we really sort of take this approach as a risk-based approach, where the inspection is based on the risk to the public with the operation of the business. So it's annualised, or it could be following something that scores in the doors. There's a number of different systems there. But as we move forward post-COVID, maybe we need to rethink some of these things. And we need to consider the technologies that are available and keep ourselves abreast of what's actually there. So that's the tried and tested approach. So what is available? The emerging technologies are clearly cameras, digital systems, the capability of videos really becoming enhanced, small videos, but high quality, high density videos. There's 3D cameras out now that you can put a single special device in a room, and it'll take a 3D scan of the room and stitch it together as a video. So that creates a lot of potential for revisiting a premises remotely. Oh dear. Sam, no, that's okay, it's not so bad. A small glitch is fine. So 3D systems and sound recording. everyone has a phone of some sort. Most people have got pretty sort of decent tech within their phone, so there's applications available. I know Dublin in the UK has used the Citizen data collector with they've got an add-on that they use to their phone to actually do air quality monitoring. Imagine if we started asking the public to post photographs of good or bad practices in the food premises that we're in. We would be inundated, because that's one thing people do, is they use their phone all the time. We know there's one of the companies has produced a noise monitoring app that the public can use and then send us recordings. So again, these things are starting to emerge, and we need to be aware of what's occurring and what's actually out there. So we know that every phone's got a camera and audio and can run apps, and these are the possible futures we need to be conscious of. We're aware of big drone technology, but there's also micro drones, drones the size of a golf ball, that are able to be flown in and actually sort of do recordings. Now, beyond that is what we call artificial intelligence. I mean, we've heard of artificial intelligence, I'm sure, but do we actually understand what it means? Well, it means that the technology can recognize faces, color, it can recognize potential practices. So if it can look at different objects, and when the objects are separated, it's okay, but when the objects come together, it's a problem. In other words, it looks at cross-contamination and could highlight to us when the practice of a food premises is actually risky or causing a hazard. So possibly we need to start looking at remote monitoring cameras. Now this gets a bit controversial, because I'm saying, well, maybe we need to have a camera in the food premises. Well, that would be great if we had a number of cameras we could actually operate and watch what's actually being carried out to identify the poor practices, because it may be the manager that's at fault, it may be the staff that are at fault, but that's part of the defence and law, isn't it? It's the fault of another person. Well, maybe the camera would actually give us that data to see who the fault is from. But we can also use it as an educational tool. We can actually sit down and show the manager or the staff what's gone wrong and the practices we're not happy with. So it gives us a deeper relevance in that premises. It gives us deeper data that we can actually start to use. And it may actually help streamline the inspection process and streamline the enforcement or educational process. And again, we could also get into the situation where the customers are watching the cameras and actually seeing their food being prepared. We've all seen kitchens with the cutouts that the public can look through and see the chef doing something. We can't see much that's happening, but that shows you the possibility and what people want to do. And again, some of the good chefs will want people to see what they're doing, because they've nothing to hide. And that's part of the logic behind what we're talking about, or I'm talking about here, is if you've nothing to hide, you've nothing to fear, and you should actually sort of use the technology to actually improve the practices. So here we have a dirty chopping board with vegetables and raw chicken side by side. Now, if we use augmentation or we use the artificial intelligence, the system will recognise, one, that the chopping board's pretty dirty, but that's a separate point, possibly. But through augmentation, it'll identify the actual chicken, highlight to the person who's watching it, give an alarm. Possibly the alarm's going to the manager, possibly the alarm's going to the member of staff, but they can see straight away there's something wrong, and they can see what the computer has found as a problem. It's identified raw chicken beside raw vegetables or food that's ready for consumption. I'm not suggesting this is where we want to go, but this is part of the future, potentially, that you could have a bank of monitors set up for remote monitoring of a number of food premises. And again, if we're running AI within the system, then the operator becomes quite passive. So you don't need an EHO to do this part of the job. You could actually have technicians that are doing it. But also it could be the member of the public who's looking at it. So they could be, or the EHO back in the office, sitting there just checking the premises that they're worried about. We know that most premises want to comply and do comply and have got a high degree of compliance. So this technology allows us to actually concentrate, much more on the problem premises. And the problem premises are the ones that we need to be doing that greater degree of sort of observation, be more vigilant with, and being able to actually sort of help them comply. And if they choose not to comply, or they're not willing to change the practices, then we've got our enforcement tools. So again, the video gives us that evidence that we can decide which direction we want to go. So that's just a quick run through about some of the ideas of the emerging technology, some of the apps that are being developed, and augmentation, which is where AI comes into the sort of the space that we're in, the real world, and augmentation gives you additionality. But augmentation is not new. We've always used noise meters. That's augmentation to some degree, but now we're taking that technology a bit further, and a bit more sort of interesting times ahead, I would suggest. So I argue that we're trying to achieve compliance for education, and augmentation gives us extra tools. When we're barcoding food, we can actually use chip technology now. So as you put food in a fridge, the fridge will read the chip. And when the food comes out of the fridge, it will read the chip again. And you'll be able to use it on the 2-hour, 4-hour rule. Or you can use it when the food's out of date, and the chip will give an alarm, and the alarm will then say that food's gone out of date, you need to throw it away. A simple thing, but it cuts down some of the human error that could occur. We can use that electronic inventory to actually look at food wastage and work out for the business where they can save money. So augmentation is not about enforcement, it can be about, as I say, that education to improve practices. As I say, the logic is if you have nothing to fear, you have nothing to hide. And if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. I don't totally support that premise, but it's a point for discussion. So that's my presentation. I'm happy now to pass back to Helen for any questions that have come through.
Thanks so much, Andrew, talking to us about transitioning from traditional inspections that we know today to using emerging technologies, and even thinking about remote inspections, which is certainly interesting. And I do agree with you that we are in interesting times coming ahead, and we do need to think outside the square. Okay, so some questions for Dr. Mathieson. Here we go. Have any of these technological methods been tried and published in journals or research?
Yeah, some of the technology has been put into practice. As I mentioned, the citizen using citizens to do data recording has been done in a number of sort of different countries. As I say, Dublin did it for air quality management. So they asked 10,000 people to go out and gave them a device attached to their phone that allowed them to do some very basic data gathering. So we've got a number of different technologies that are sort of cutting edge. So we're not quite in a position that's been published in practice journals, but they are being there is AI. And a lot of people are using AI in different spaces. As I said, the other app that I'm aware of more recently is the acoustic app, where you actually get people to record an acoustic event, send it off to the EHO, so the EHO can then decide whether there could be a nuisance or not, and then send down your monitoring kit, so your expensive stuff comes down separately. So it allows you to prioritise your work to some extent. But this is emerging. This is what the concept is. It's not there yet. It's not all there, but there's a lot of people working on it, and breakthroughs have been made all the time.
Oh, interesting. Certainly something we're going to have to keep our eye on. Okay, everyone seems to be talking about COVID. How do you think the augmentation, as you call it, would help in times of COVID?
Well, again, let's say that we decided we're going to target our high-risk premises, and we get an agreement from them to put cameras in, not to capture people. We're not about sort of trying to find fault all the time. We're there to try and educate. And if people trust us and we trust them, then you can put cameras up around the premises to look at the practices they're doing. And what you may do is say that we'll put the red light on when we're watching, and the red light will be off when we're not watching. There's a number of ways of doing this without people feeling too intruded upon. But the premise is, if you're actually doing good practices, then what difference does it make if the camera's there? You're still doing good practices. You're just somebody's watching you. And as long as the agreement is we're not going to prosecute for every single small thing we see going wrong, that's about trust. And trust is the big thing about inspections. That a business manager, a business owner, if they trust us and we see us as part of their compliance strategy, then a camera's not a fearful thing. So it's definitely worth considering, and definitely worth talking to people about it and showing the benefits without using it as another stick. We don't need sticks. We've got good enforcement powers. We can use them. Let's use this for education and work with businesses. It's far more successful to work with a business and change the culture.
Absolutely. I think this is a watch this space. So thank you, Dr. Mathieson, for sharing that with us. It's making us think, certainly, and I'm sure more of this information will be coming out in the future. So thank you for starting that off for us. And for
Thank you.
joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Looking forward to introduce our next speaker, Tony Burns, who is a leading expert on Legionella. Tony, welcome to LiveChat with EHA today, and we're super keen to hear what you have to share with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Good morning. And like Andrew, I think I'm going to rely on Sam to run the technology. New South Wales Health, as typical of the government, has got some very tight firewalls, and Stream Live just would not get me in. So thanks, Sam, for that. And look, next slide. Thanks, Sam. Okay, guys, look, I'm just going to touch on this morning, and probably many of you have heard some of this in the past, some issues around Legionella. Where have we been in the last 20 plus years? Obviously, things first started in New South Wales, predominantly in 1987. And for my sins back then, I was around as part of the outbreak team that was involved in the investigation of the first outbreak in New South Wales in Wollongong in 1987. At that stage, there were 44 cases and there were 10 deaths, so 25% fatality rate. Was in a shopping centre. It was fairly new to EHOs. It was in a cooling tower, which again was sort of new technology to EHOs. And it was on top of a chemist shop, so it wasn't the easiest place to find. Sam, the next slide, please. And look, you know, colleagues have seen there was a lot of media around at that time. And the next slide. Media love headlines, especially around Legionella. Search widens for bacteria, suspect buildings revealed. So look, it was an interesting time. That's all right. You can go to the next one. Thanks, Sam. I'm going to touch on just a few of the outbreaks that have occurred in New South Wales over the last 20 plus years. We've had them in Sydney, predominantly around the Sydney metro area, in Marylands in Sydney in 1989. It was a Marylands bowling club, and it was, again, a small cooling tower. The line that I put there in red, again, was in 1989, but not in New South Wales. It was in Burnie in Tasmania. It was the Northwest Regional Hospital. And that's pretty significant for us in New South Wales, and it ended up being significant for Australia. It was where the then Australian health ministers were meeting. The hospital where they're all meeting in Burnie was implicated in an outbreak, and things just started to snowball from then. Our minister at the time, who was Peter Collins back 20 plus years ago, came back and things were put in place, and we started to have legislation to try and control this very small bacteria. And it's really led to where we are today. In 1992, we had an outbreak in one of the Western Sydney suburbs of Fairfield, again, a cooling tower in the Fairfield CBD area. Following few years, 1993, 94, Western Sydney, Parramatta, again, a club and a hotel, again, a cooling tower. Most of our outbreaks have predominantly been related to cooling towers. Yes, we have had cases of Legionella associated with Legionella Long Beachy, which is associated with potting mix, but we have not had major outbreaks associated with potting mix. And our most recent outbreaks were in 2016 in Sydney, where we had 2 outbreaks in the early part of 2016 in the Sydney CBD area, and again, it was tied into cooling towers. Thanks, Sam. The next slide. And look, that shows a graph of just where our cases have been over the last 20 plus years. Predominantly has nothing new. It's always been in the 20s, 30s numbers of cases annually, and the sort of time frame that you'll see, and that's probably the next slide. Thank you, Sam. Our cases are predominantly in March, April, May. That's sort of end of summer, before we head into winter. We had autumn period when we seemed to be cycling from constant air conditioning into transitional time when we are then moving out of full air conditioning. In the past, maybe it's been an issue when systems haven't been as operated as they should have been. Let's hope that changes now in moving forward, at least in our state anyway, with the way we've gone with changes to legislation. Thank you, Sam. The next one. Look, I'm really happy to be able to say that I've worked in New South Wales Health for many, many years. Health has a very clear notification procedure in place. We're not a lot different to the other states in that regard. We have clear case definitions for confirmed and probable cases, and that's important. We have an excellent surveillance system and contact tracing staff that work both in our head office and our local public health units. And look, everybody can attest to that at the moment because of the huge work they're involved in with the COVID outbreak. Across the state, not just in public health units, but in local councils, we have excellent first-rate environmental health officers who assist in the investigation, because it's not just a clinical investigation, it's an environmental investigation as well. And we have fantastic links between the public health network and local council, because it's a combined process we need to involve our local council colleagues if we are investigating cases that are maybe linked to an outbreak. And we also have an outstanding clinical and environmental laboratory service in our state that is able to support the work of our EHOs in the collection of samples and the analysis of those, and also tie in the work that the clinicians do in the investigation side of it. Thanks, Sam, you beat me to it. Look, back in the early 90s when all this legislation first kicked in, cooling towers were really old, were really probably not as well maintained as we see these days. Access was hard for both inspection and also for maintenance, and they weren't really turned over and maintained as probably they could have been and updated as regularly as we see these days. And I think all of that leads to the problems that we have seen in the past. Thanks, Sam. The next slide. Look, as I said, 1989, when things first kicked off in Burnie in Tasmania, led to the start of introduction of legislation. And look, we've got some pretty heavy, hard-hitting legislation in and around Australia, specifically in New South Wales, where we try and smash this little bacteria from causing us problems. We started off in 1991 with the then 91 Public Health Act and regulations. We had a section in there dealing with microbial control. And it then set the scene for really where EHOs have worked with a whole range of other stakeholders to uplift the process as we have seen in the last 20 plus years. Thanks, Sam. The next slide. And the last bit on that slide actually is the update of the regulation in 2000. And yes, the next slide there shows very clearly why it led into the Sydney Olympics. And the last thing we wanted to see was any problems associated with Legionella during the Sydney Olympics of 2000. Thanks, Sam. We have continued to have legislation and legislation updates. The Public Health Act of 2010, our regulation of 2012 is updated. And the more recent one, the regulation was updated. The microbial control, Legionella control regulation was updated in 2018, following the outbreak that I mentioned a little bit earlier in Sydney. And there's a slide there showing the photo of the current guidelines that New South Wales Health has put in place. We have had also to support our legislation, codes of practice and more recently guidelines. Where some of those codes of practice in the past sat, it was probably a little bit hard from the point of view of whether it was a legislative document or not. But these days, that guideline that's flagged there on the slide is very clearly pulled up as a supporting document to the current Public Health Microbial Control, Legionella Control Reg of 2018. Thanks, Sam. And look, the regulations have been very clear. The purpose has been to regulate the installation, the operation and the maintenance of certain kinds of systems. And very early on, from 1991, we had 6 regulated systems in New South Wales: air handling, evaporative cooling, hot water, humidifying, warm water and water cooling systems. Why we regulated those? It was probably the introduction of the Australian standards that happened back in the early 90s as well. And we didn't have the public health expertise to guide the sort of systems that we were involved in back in the early 90s, because it was new ground to us. These systems have, look, always been around, and they've operated as part of an air conditioning or a building maintenance system or a building services system. But it hasn't been an issue in the past from the point of view of microbial control. And we very clearly introduced that when we introduced legislation. Next slide, please. Yep, that's it. And look, to support where we have introduced the legislation, we have had Australian standards. And I'm sure, as all of our colleagues know, Australian standards are there to support best practice. Australian standards are developed by a whole range of stakeholders who have relevant expertise in that field, and they bring that information together, working with standards to bring out generally a very good document. Standards have had a good process in place of updating the standards over the years. We started off really very clearly with only parts 1 and 2 of the standard, which dealt with the design, installation, commissioning, and also maintenance of systems. Standards, because of industry support, moved then on and developed 2 additional systems, and that was really around performance-based maintenance for cooling towers and also performance-based maintenance for air handling systems. It's really pushing the expertise back and the maintenance into where it really clearly sits, and that's back with the industry people who really work with these systems day in and day out. Next slide, please. To support that, our legislation in the past was fairly prescriptive, and it really worried me in the past about how we were prescribing things that were there, as I said, to control this very small bacteria. The prescriptive legislation did adopt the Australian Standard 3666. However, in more recent times, in 2018, when the regulation was amended following the outbreak in Sydney in 2016, we've gone to a performance-based approach. We've kept eventually in line with the way the standards have gone. Thanks, Sam. The next one. We stuck with the same sort of format that standards have, and we've really prescribed information and guidance around to support the standard around the installation, the operation and the maintenance requirements for those systems. We really want to ensure that they're installed correctly, they're operated correctly, and they're maintained more so from a public health point of view. In the past, New South Wales Health in the early 1990s, as part of the introduction of the first legislation, approved of processes of disinfection. That was really around approved processes to control the water treatment in these systems. It was performance-based, even though we prescribed it should comply with no more than 10 CFU per mil for Legionella and a bacterial level as well. Whether that was the right thing or not, it worked at the time. Now, because we are operating under a performance-based maintenance approach, water treatment companies very clearly pick up their role in that regard. Thanks, Sam. As part of the process that has not changed, we know that we need to work very clearly with our local government colleagues across the state. And it has always been an issue in the regulations that we ask local councils to keep a register of water cooling and warm water systems in their area. They've needed to get that information from building owners, and local councils keep it very well. And they make that information available to us, and we work jointly in the conduct of an outbreak investigation scenario. And look, guys, it's nothing new. You're all hearing the same sort of thing these days with COVID. we need to know information about where people have been so that our contact tracing people can do their job. Same scenario with Legionella. So we're building on the good public health work that we've all been involved in for many, many years. Thanks, Sam. Look, very clearly in moving forward, some of the responsibilities have always been there. Some of them have changed, but very clearly the new legislation has tried to put the onus of responsibility back with those who have the control, and we rely on working with local councils to ensure that that is put in place. Responsibilities have always been there for the owner and occupier of premises. They're ultimately responsible for the way their systems are installed, operated and maintained. Even though they might put the responsibility back to contractors, ultimately the responsibility sits with the building owner and in some cases the occupier. We have introduced a new, I suppose, role of the duly qualified person. Even though you might have an owner who's very clearly the only person that has full responsibility, they don't have the onus, the expertise to run the system on a day-to-day basis. We rely on the duly qualified person to ensure that the overall site management is put in place and that they follow the required information, whether it be in the Australian standard, the legislation, and more clearly these days in the risk management plan as part of the performance-based approach. Thank you, Sam. The risk management approach, we've very clearly said, should be put in place by someone who has the knowledge and the expertise in that area, a risk assessor. So the risk management plan is put in place using the guidelines that are in the Australian Standard 3666 Part 3 and the information that is held by the building owner. And that risk management plan needs to be checked. Local councils play a very clear role in that, but also the auditor. The auditors play a very clear role in providing independent advice to local councils on a 12-month basis predominantly. The auditor is a new role, and local councils can, I'm sure, be aware that New South Wales Health has provided lists of auditors. Those auditors are trained using TAFE in New South Wales, and we do pick up and recognise other interstate qualifications. We do require that that auditor be independent, and we're working in the first year as we are now to ensure that those auditors are doing the right thing. We are starting to see some of the audits reappearing, and local councils are doing an excellent job in monitoring that. Thanks, Sam. The next slide. The responsibilities really haven't changed in regard to our role as authorised officers. Whether you work in local councils or within our public health units or in some cases within the ministry. The authorised officers have typically been an EHA. They do have delegated powers, and we do have very good, clear powers to assist us in the overall administration of this legislation. To enter and inspect, to obtain documents, and if needed, as Andrew has just mentioned, to undertake enforcement action. And public health units work very closely with their local council colleagues to put that in place. Next slide, thanks, Sam. Getting closer towards the end of the presentation. There are some clear responsibilities, and as I said, they really haven't changed for local government around the keeping of a register. But local councils, because of their very clear local role, receive information around risk management plans, around the audit. They do receive mandatory notifications where high bacterial levels are exceeded. And they do work with us in following up on outbreaks at a local level. Thank you, Sam. The next slide. And finally, look, I do want to wrap it up by saying health does very clearly rely on the working in partnership with all those involved. Local council colleagues they are probably closest partner in microbial control and with all public health legislation. But there are a range of other partners out there that us in public health and also local government need to work very closely with, whether they're building owners, the general public to try and get that information of what's out there. Equipment installers, equipment manufacturers, maintenance contractors, water treatment companies, and look, the media. You can see a couple of photos there on that last slide of some media extracts that were taken from the 2016 outbreak. The media love Legionella. It's one of those that for some reason does get their interest. But I think the very last slide says, I'm very happy to take any questions. Throwing back to you. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for reminding us about Legionella control being obviously our bread and butter as EHOs, and what's really come out from your presentation is your dedication to, the public health response to Legionella control and the work that you have done in New South Wales Health to, get it to the point that it is today. And I do know that health departments around the country do collaborate, and we certainly have with New South Wales Health. So thank you. Any questions for Tony? Yes, we do. Are you aware of any video training material of cooling tower inspections and sampling for Legionella?
No, not video training material. Look, I should say that there was a video that was put together many, many years ago. It's no longer around. There's nothing at the moment. But look, training is always one of those in New South Wales, and has worked very closely over the years with EHA to ensure that our EHO colleagues are kept up to date with any of the changes around inspections, around sampling, and around outbreak investigation, because they play a very close role in working with us. But no, I'm sorry, there's nothing around about videos.
Andrew, are you aware of how the introduction of risk management plans has affected compliance and or Legionella cases?
Look, I think the risk management approach has taken a little bit of time to settle in New South Wales. We have seen and had feedback from local council colleagues that it has been a bit of a rocky start, making sure that everybody was aware of the changes, making sure that the people that were there to do the work, someone to develop a risk management plan, whether they were there and available, and now making sure that auditors are available. It's been a bit of a rocky introduction. We're 2 years nearly into the post-legislation changes. Look, case numbers, no, they haven't changed a lot. We'll never get rid of Legionella. Legionella, best we can do is try and control it in the equipment that we see out there these days. So that's why it's pretty important to ensure that we continue to collaborate to maintain the systems as best they can. Do local EHOs still conduct cooling tower audits in New South Wales, and are independent auditors now only used? Look, a formal approach, independent auditors are the ones that are legally required to sign off on the audit certificate. We want to ensure that there is that clear break between the role that EHOs have as a regulator and be able to oversee the audit certificate and the audit process. Our role as EHOs is always that of being an independent auditor, but the formal audit of a risk management plan and a cooling tower system is now done by an approved auditor.
Interesting. Thank you. Well, that's all the questions that we have for you, Tony, and we do appreciate, again, your time in joining us on live chat today and being a part of this EHA session. So thank you so much for that.
All good. Thanks very much, Helen. Always happy to help.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Cameron Webb, who is actually going to pose a very interesting question for us today. It is, are we prepared for a mosquito-borne disease pandemic? So as EHOs, we do have to be ready for emerging issues so that we can be better prepared. So Dr. Webb, in anticipation, we are very interested in what you have to share with us today. Thank you and welcome.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Helen. I'd like to start by sort of acknowledging that I'm giving this talk today from the traditional lands of the Wangal people of the Eora Nation. I'm just kind of in northern inner west of Sydney. And so, yeah, today what I want to talk a little bit about is how prepared we may be for a mosquito-borne disease pandemic. It's something that environmental health officers are involved in. I work closely with environmental health officers here in New South Wales, trying to prepare to reduce the burden of mosquito-borne disease, not just at the moment, but perhaps into the future. And we all know that mosquitoes pose a health risk. The transmission of pathogens that cause malaria and dengue are one of the reasons why mosquitoes are considered one of the most dangerous animals on the planet. So it would kind of make sense, wouldn't it, that perhaps one of these established mosquito-borne pathogens, if there was an outbreak in Australia, would be considered a significant health concern. But it's interesting that perhaps what's going to be the problem is not what we know about now, but something which was a little bit unexpected. And it's important to remember the last great sort of public health emergency of international concern was actually caused by Zika virus back in 2016. And much of what we learned in responding to Zika virus would really set us up in place to respond to any future pandemic that might be associated with mosquito-borne disease. Some of the things that we were thinking about during this time about Zika virus and the threat it posed to Australia is what we'll really be considering in the future when we think about other types of mosquitoes that might make their way to Australia, the spread of mosquitoes that might be somewhat limited in their distribution at the moment to more widespread metropolitan areas of Australia, but also thinking about the emergence of some of these pathogens, a little bit like Zika. We knew about Zika for more than 70 years or so before it became a problem. What about all of these other mosquito-borne viruses that at the moment we don't really think about posing a significant health concern? What happens to them when new strains or changes happen in these viruses or other pathogens that might create a more significant public health concern? How do we respond to that? But of course, we've already got an incredibly diverse range of mosquitoes in Australia. We have over 300 species, and relatively few of those pose significant pest or public health concern, but those small numbers can really create a problem. And the fact that these mosquitoes are highly adapted to particular types of environments means that when you move around the country, a different suite of mosquitoes might be driving some of the outbreaks of local mosquito-borne disease every year. So the mosquitoes that cause outbreaks of things like Ross River virus in coastal Victoria will be different to those that cause problems in inland New South Wales, southeast Queensland and the Northern Territory, or over in Western Australia. And so we need to understand the local mosquitoes that are in a particular area, their capacity to transmit these pathogens, not just our local pathogens, but those overseas. And that way we can develop strategic plans to respond to any of these future pest or public health concerns. And I guess one of those biggest concerns we think about is climate change. It makes sense that if we're living in a warmer world, that's going to be better for mosquitoes. But it's not just as simple as thinking about how the climate changes and how mosquitoes respond to that. There's a whole range of factors that are going to shape the future risks and perhaps a future mosquito-borne disease pandemic that's going to be a concern. And that's about the spread of invasive mosquitoes, the spread of mosquitoes that aren't currently found or widespread in Australia, or perhaps the emergence of novel viruses or strains of viruses that may be more problematic for human health or might be spread by a different suite of mosquito species. We often overlook the genetic changes of viruses when we think about our future mosquito-borne disease risks. We concentrate more on the climate, but there's a range of factors that we need to be keeping in mind. But it's not just how the environment's changing, the mosquitoes, or even the pathogens themselves. It's how humans are changing the environment as well. And so things like temperature, tides, sea level, and rainfall, the way they change around the country is going to influence the future response of mosquitoes. But we've also got to think about other things as well. That's not just how we change the environment through land use. You know, we're building urban developments closer and closer to known mosquito habitats more than ever before. We're trying to green our cities by putting in wetlands and increasing green cover. And those wetlands and bioretention swales and stormwater infrastructure may be creating opportunities for mosquitoes. We're also recognising the damage we've done to our environment. We're trying to rehabilitate a lot of our wetlands. And unfortunately, although in some circumstances, problematic mosquito populations may be a symptom of the poor health of an environment, we're trying to kind of expand some of these wetland areas close to where a lot of people live, and that might bring a risk to human health. And lastly, we can't think about Australia's mosquito-borne disease without thinking about our wildlife. Mosquitoes don't hatch out of the wetlands carrying a virus. They've got to bite an animal first to pick that up. And commonly that's things like kangaroos and wallabies. But the ways in which we manage urban wildlife in our cities may as well have an impact on these outbreaks of disease. And so here in Sydney, for instance, we do see clusters of locally acquired Ross River virus disease, and that's almost always where we have some kind of populations of native macropods. And we're finding that swamp wallabies in particular are penetrating further into our cities than ever before. And so some of these things are what are going to drive future mosquito-borne disease risks as well. We have some really great surveillance programs in place, and environmental health officers here in New South Wales play a really critical part of the New South Wales arbovirus and surveillance program. They set traps every week during the warmer months, and that data that's collected from mosquitoes helps provide information to the ministry about how we might respond to and provide an early warning of mosquito-borne disease risk. We don't do a lot of control in New South Wales, but that is done in other states of Australia, and that can be effective at suppressing mosquito populations and assisting in reducing the risks of mosquito-borne disease. But here in New South Wales, we concentrate a lot on public health education and raising awareness, whether it be media releases or signs that are erected on a temporary nature around some of our wetlands once we detect these viruses. So we're really good at monitoring some of our local pathogens. But we've got to think about what's around the corner. And in many respects, these new threats, particularly those that may be posed by exotic mosquitoes and exotic mosquito-borne pathogens, we've got to shift our surveillance programs. And that shift is putting a lot of strain on our local health authority because there are financial and operational considerations that need to be taken into account. A great example of that might be the threat that the yellow fever mosquito or the tiger mosquito poses to Australia, where that's going to be a problem in our suburbs, not our swamps, and we've got to respond to our surveillance programs accordingly. Our colleagues in Queensland have some really well designed response and management plans to things like dengue and chikungunya. We don't quite have those here in New South Wales, but some of the work I've been doing in recent years has been trying to build the capacity amongst our environmental health officers at council and our public health unit to be able to get out into the suburbs and look for these exotic mosquitoes, because if we can detect them early, we're a better place to be able to eradicate them or at least suppress their numbers in a significant way. We certainly don't want to have mosquitoes widespread in the metropolitan areas of Australia that can be posing a risk of transmitting some of these more serious mosquito-borne pathogens, things like dengue, chikungunya, Zika, maybe even yellow fever virus. And so the work we're doing is trying to better understand not only how the environmental health officers can respond to this threat and change in surveillance programs, but also how we can communicate it to the residents. Once we're out in these backyards in the suburbs talking to the community, particularly in far north New South Wales, we've been finding that there are still gaps in the understanding of the community about what even the local mosquito-borne disease risks are at the moment. And so we're trying to develop programs now to more effectively change the behaviour of the community, give them reminders and techniques and tricks as to how they can reduce the opportunities for mosquitoes breeding in their backyards, because that's going to be a really critical step if we were to have to respond to one of these exotic mosquito threats. So if we do need to eradicate the mosquitoes, what are we going to do? Historically, we've actually impacted the environment by trying to eradicate mosquitoes. This great clipping here that comes from the 1920s in Sydney reports on the local community trying to advocate for the spraying of kerosene along the Parramatta River. And there's no doubt some of the ways we've tried to control mosquitoes has adversely impacted the environment. Now we have much more ecologically sustainable ways to control mosquitoes coming out of our natural wetlands. And we've got a lot of really fantastic programs around the country that keep in mind the potential risks to the environment, and they're still effectively suppressing mosquito populations, but other approaches may be required if we have these exotic mosquitoes make their way into our suburbs. We know that around the world, some of the indiscriminate use of insecticides, these clouds of synthetic pyrethroids that are used during outbreaks of dengue in South America and Southeast Asia, are cheap. They can be effective, but the problem is we're very rapidly driving a rise of insecticide resistance in these mosquito populations. Not only does that pose a risk for these countries that are suffering because of it, but it's also a risk here in New South Wales, for instance. So if an exotic mosquito was to make its way to Australia and it's resistant to these commonly used insecticides, we may be less capable to eradicate them. So there are new techniques and technologies being developed that are going to really assist in responding to some of these exotic threats, particularly if we were to deal with a pandemic of a pathogen spread by mosquitoes like Aedes aegypti. The World Mosquito Project has done some wonderful work implementing the release of mosquitoes reared in the laboratory and infected with Wolbachia that essentially stops the mosquito being able to transmit the virus if it was to bite an infected traveller or someone carrying something like dengue or Zika virus. There's a whole range of options that are available in the implementation of this essentially a biological engineering of mosquitoes that can impact mosquitoes in different kinds of ways. And so as well as blocking their ability to transmit the pathogen, maybe we can look at ways that it's going to actually reduce the mosquito population or eradicate some of these invasive mosquitoes. And the experience in far north Queensland has been wonderful, and that the number of locally transmitted cases of dengue have fallen considerably, almost disappeared because of this Wolbachia project. And just in the recent weeks, the World Mosquito Project has reported on some fantastic outcomes in Indonesia, where they've been able to substantially reduce the rates of dengue virus. But there's always going to be these new techniques that are going to require other responses from authorities. Recently, there's been a lot of controversy around the approvals to use genetically modified mosquitoes in Florida, for instance. This approach has also been used successfully to reduce mosquito populations in South America. But this response from the local community is going to be a barrier to the implementation of this approach, an approach that maybe is quite ecologically sensitive. So irrespective of the techniques we're using, we're going to have a really strong connection to our local community. And environmental health officers are a really great way to facilitate that. So are we prepared for a mosquito-borne disease pandemic? I think we have the foundations of great mosquito monitoring and control already in Australia. And we're already sort of quite well placed, but we have to make sure that we have greater capacity to shift our focus, whether that's from the wetlands into the suburbs to control some mosquito populations. And I think the way we can develop targeted strategies will certainly help with our response into the future. So thanks very much for listening, and a really great pleasure to be part of this session this morning.
Thank you for your time with us this morning, Dr. Webb. And you also reminded us about Zika, which I had forgotten in my memory. So thanks for bringing that back to our attention. And I will remember your comments in that mosquitoes are the most dangerous animals on the planet. So that scared me, but no, it's cool. And also obviously talking about our changing climate and how that will increase the risk of mosquito-borne disease transmission, and also to think about the urban design work that we are doing and building next to wetlands. So thank you for that. And I think most importantly, you mentioned about changing the behaviour of our community to reduce their risk of exposure. So if we start doing that now, we'll be better prepared to keep doing that in the future with your help, obviously. So thank you. Some questions for Dr. Webb. Okay, what could be learned from the COVID-19 response that is specifically relevant to the future mosquito-borne disease threats?
Yeah, I think one of the most important lessons we've learned is about public health communication. And as I've watched the briefings from around the country, and we talk about how we get people to change their behaviour and hand washing and things like that, I think we can learn the ways in which we might communicate to people if we should get the introduction of an exotic mosquito into the suburbs of Sydney or other metropolitan areas of Australia, but also really good, clear lines of communication, keep the community informed, give them good, reliable information, and present to them experts they can trust. I think many of that public health communication that we've experienced through COVID, we can really learn from in the mosquito world and dealing with, what might be a future threat, or not even just a routine seasonal threat in many parts of Australia.
Super important. Thank you for bringing that up. That's excellent. Another question, has there been any success in controlling native wildlife populations to control viruses?
Yeah, that's a really novel idea, and I'm thinking about the ways that we manage wildlife to reduce their exposure to mosquitoes is a really important one. It's really not something that's been implemented very well, but as an urban planning strategy, making sure that you're not putting wildlife corridors right through the middle of a new dense urban development is really important. But also it's important to consider that mosquito control can have a really useful part to play here. And I think it's important to consider, as people live close to these wetlands where there is a disease risk, being smart about sustainable mosquito control is something that local authorities will really need to consider.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that information with us today, Dr. Webb. We appreciate your time you've taken with us. And again, thank you for being a part of today.
Yeah, thanks. My absolute pleasure. See you later, everybody.
Thank you. Moving on to our next speaker, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Yakindra Timilsena, who is a food research scientist. So we welcome you to our chat today, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you, Helen. Thank you very much. Thanks for providing me this opportunity. Very good morning from Chile, Melbourne. Today's talk is on food safety during pandemic and the role of environmental health officer. I have already gone through a lot of previous speakers on the safety aspects, all the role of the environment health officer and the advancement in this area. Basically, food is a fuel or provide energy, and it also works as a medicine, and it's a means of social connection. But these all the functions of food is will be achieved only when it is safe. If it is not safe, then it doesn't work. We can't say it's food. The main aspect of making food safe is one of the state's activity or the regulator's activity or food business activity to ensure there is absence of any food hazard, or if the food hazard is present, then it is within the safe or acceptable level. Mainly the hazards can be microbiological, chemical or physical hazard. And food safety means the assurance that food will not harm the consumer, and it's achieved by handling, preparing, storing and transporting food in such a way that it reduces the risk of the foodborne diseases. Mainly the food safety hazards are three types: biological, chemical and physical. Mainly biological hazards are the great concern, like the bacteria, viruses, parasites and mold. As in this pandemic situation, we are struggling with the viruses. Although this COVID virus is not transmitted through food. The basic food safety activities here will be the hand washing or cleaning and sanitizing protocols, and cooking or processing methods, mainly to ensure that the food is cooked and processed well enough to kill all the pathogens, and storage condition and temperature control. The storing food below or beyond the temperature danger zone, that is either below 5 degrees Celsius or above 60 degrees Celsius. So during heating or processing, the temperature of the food material, the core of the food, need to reach above 60 degrees Celsius, and it need to store below 5 degrees Celsius. So there is another rule of 2 hour and 4 hour also. Everybody is aware of, I think. The foodborne diseases, mainly they cause around 6 million illnesses. People fall sick due to foodborne diseases, and it causes around 420,000 deaths every year, among which 30%, around 125,000, are children. In Australia, the data is so that it's 14,800 food poisoning cases per day, and it becomes 5.4 million cases per year, and it is showing that 14,700 hospital admissions and 76 deaths. It cost around 3 billion per year in associated costs like the productivity and medical expenses, loss of the productivity and medical expenses. The role of the environment health officer, mainly environment health officers are the local food safety regulator, and they basically inspect the food businesses to ensure the food safety, and the hygiene practices protocols are in place, and they are based on the risk-based approach. Mainly, they can also make people aware and conduct some of the training program to the food businesses, and one of the other thing is the incorporation of the food allergen control guidelines into the hazard analysis system, as food allergens are also one of the great food illness agent. Therefore, the control of food allergen is also essential, and it need to be included in the inspection system by the environment health officer. Mainly, food safety and hygiene inspection is the process of regulatory check to ensure food is clean and safe to consume, and then it is an effective way to protect consumer from potential foodborne illness. And during this pandemic, mainly if the frequency of the inspection can be increased, then the foodborne illness can be reduced, and the environment health officer can also ensure COVID safe measures are implemented, and as many states or many countries have implemented this scores on doors program, and that also ensures that food business are following the hygiene and safety protocols, and the one with the highest standard is given 5-star rating. This is one. There are two effects of the current pandemic. One is positive and negative effect. Positive effect is increase in the hand hygiene practices, basically to control the disease. All the resources, all the information is circulated and shared to general public to make sure that the hand hygiene is practiced regularly, using alcohol rubs or washing hands properly. And due to this improved food handling practices, also like in the food businesses or in domestic level, also people are becoming more aware of the food handling practices. Industries are also following the GMP guidelines to ensure that the food is produced in a safe way. And another positive effect is reduced eating out. It mainly due to the lockdown or the closure of the outlets, food service outlet. But there are many food service who provide the takeaway or home delivery service, etc. But many people are focusing on preparing food at home, and it caused the decreased foodborne illnesses due to hand hygiene practices. And there are some negative impact also. Sedentary lifestyle due to lockdown and increased consumption of food and alcohol. It can have some bad impact or the risk of the nutritional pandemic in the future if it continues. Only the conclusions are increase in hygiene practices, domestic and industrial settings showed positive impact on public health. this is one of the positive outcome from the COVID-19. Effective and more frequent inspection and law enforcement is essential to monitor compliance with COVID-safe policies and programs, and awareness and training programs can provide the food handlers and processors it will equip them with knowledge and the skills to deal with the foodborne illnesses. And incorporation of allergen control program in food safety inspection is essential. And as from the previous discussion also, if we are practicing hand hygiene more frequently in these days, and it need to continue in the future also. Continuation of these stricter hygiene practices are essential to reduce the foodborne illnesses. Thank you for your time. Any question?
Thank you, Dr. Timilsena. That was excellent information about food safety. And I do like how you pointed out that there were positive outcomes for the food industry business during this time, which increased, hand hygiene measures and also improved food handling. I do notice when I go out for restaurants that everyone's got their own separate salt and pepper and cheese and all sorts of things. So it has changed the way that we've operated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, here's one. Is there evidence that foodborne illness has decreased during COVID, I guess because of the measures that you were talking about?
Yeah, actually, I haven't seen any published paper, but I have gone through some of the websites, and they have mentioned that the foodborne illness has been decreased during this COVID-19, but haven't seen any journal articles or research paper in that.
Or maybe that's to come. Thank you. Any other questions? We have. Yes, we do. Could you please speak more perhaps about the nutritional pandemic that you refer to, and potentially what data is available to show that this is the case?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very good question, actually. I attended a talk program also last time with Food Safety Standards Australia and New Zealand. And there was a discussion like I haven't gone through data or any articles, but what I seen that the consumption of food and alcohol has been increased during this pandemic period. Due to lockdown, people don't have any job, just sitting at home and watching television and preparing food, mainly spending time with family, but it connects with the food. And due to this, the physical exercise has been reduced, and in many cases, like in case of Victoria, we have suffered a lot longer lockdown, and the exercise has been also restricted. Gyms are closed, and due to this, I think it will lead to a nutritional pandemic in the future, because the consumption is high. If the diet is not balanced, or if we rely on the processed food, consumption of alcohol increase, then there will be definitely a pandemic situation in the future. But since I went through the sites to collect the data, and there are still not any articles published yet, but with the discussion with the experts, I came through this information, and I thought it will be a good idea to share in this forum.
Dr. Timilsena, thank you for reminding us that we should all be exercising during this time due to the consumption. I think I'll take that one away for myself. much for joining us today and sharing that information with us on LiveChat for Environmental Health Australia. We do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so our next speaker will give us a different perspective now. Alysha Riley is an EHO that has just undergone baptism by fire into the field of environmental health. She has started in her role this year. So Alysha, we are very keen to hear your experiences as an EHO for the first time this year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you so much for the opportunity. So as Helen said, my name's Alysha, and I'm going to speak to you today about the South Australian COVID-19 directions and the role of an EHO. So I work for Eastern Health Authority, which is a regional subsidiary established under the Local Government Act, and we provide public and environmental health services across our 5 constituent council areas. I'm a relatively new EHO, as Helen said, having completed the graduate diploma only last year, and I began at Eastern Health Authority in January. Prior to this, I have 8 years' experience in respiratory sciences, specifically clinical trials and pulmonary function. Of course, the pandemic reached Australia soon after I began my new role in late January, early February, and on the 22nd of March, the State Coordinator, Grant Stevens, made a declaration of a major emergency under Section 23 of the Emergency Management Act due to the outbreak of disease named COVID-19. South Australia is currently still under an extension of the original emergency declaration. Our whole organisation had to quickly pivot at that time to take on the new responsibility. During this time, there was far less supervision than another new EHO might have had, and I was, and we all were, required to work quite independently and think on our feet. So there have been several different directions enacted, and of these, several different versions, as you can see, as the time has gone on and as the risk of COVID has changed, and these apply to everyone living in and entering South Australia. The directions that the EHOs have been enforcing largely are the Emergency Management Gatherings Direction and the Non-Essential Business, and then later the Public Activities Directions. In the earlier months, it was the Gatherings Directions that prevented large gatherings in public spaces. The Non-Essential Business and Other Activities Directions decreed that defined premises must close, with exceptions such as supermarkets. These directions were created and enacted very rapidly and were effective immediately. In the earlier days of these new directions, there was no real training for us EHOs and often very minimal guidance. There were difficulties in interpretation of the directions, as you could imagine, for local and state government and the community generally. And in some cases, the intention of the direction was misinterpreted. These factors, coupled with elevated anxiety in the community, created a challenging situation for EHOs trying to communicate their requirements to the public. So EHOs and some other local government officers that had been authorised under the Public Health Act performed compliance checks in our constituent council areas from April onwards to ensure that those premises that were directed to close had closed, and those who were allowed to remain open were adhering to the requirements under the Act. We were also monitoring public spaces and enforcing the gathering directions where necessary. The approach has always been initially one of education and encouragement to comply. If then non-compliances are not resolved, we would escalate the matter to SAPOL, but thankfully those instances were rare, and the non-compliances we observed were largely due to a lack of understanding of the requirements. Most business were keen to be compliant. And as the risk of COVID-19 changed in the state, the directions have also changed accordingly. We are currently up to Public Activities Direction number 9. This has meant that it's very important as EHOs that we are familiar with the latest directions so that we are providing the community with correct, up-to-date information. So to use an example now, once the restrictions began to ease and businesses were reopening, we were receiving a high volume of complaints that were physical distancing in nature from the community. The complacency in our community, coupled with community spread of COVID-19 in our neighbouring state Victoria, were I think were definitely contributing factors to the heightened anxiety that we were seeing. Many of the complaints received were for one food business in particular. This food business is very popular and located on a busy main street, and we'll call this business Busy Street Cafe. And the photo there is just for an example. So during 2 inspections, I observed that this business was extremely busy, with customers who were in many cases not adhering or not able to adhere to the physical distancing principle, that is maintaining 1.5 metres of space between one another. I also observed that the queue for people waiting to be seated in this business was obstructing the footpath, making it impossible for passers-by to use the footpath without breaching the principle. So based on these inspections, I could certainly recognise why the community had been raising concerns, and so I went back to the directions to determine if the business was compliant or not. The direction at the time was the Emergency Management Public Activities number 4 direction, which decreed that the density requirement must be complied with. The density requirement, for those of you who don't know, requires businesses to determine the area of floor space of their business available to patrons in square metres, and then assigns a maximum safe number of customers that can be in the premises at one time. This is unquestionably a requirement and part of their COVID safe plan, and Busy Street Cafe was compliant with this requirement. The physical distancing principle, however, requires that proprietors must also take reasonable steps, is the wording, to ensure that the facility allows for compliance with the physical distancing principle. Reasonable steps aren't further quantified in the direction, which leaves it very open to interpretation and made it quite tricky as an officer enforcing it. Whilst they had taken some COVID safe measures, to acknowledge that, on balance, it was determined that the business could be doing more to allow for physical distancing. So we were considering issuing a notice under Section 92 of the Public Health Act, which states that a relevant authority may issue a notice under this section for the purpose of securing compliance with the requirement imposed by or under this Act, or averting, eliminating or minimising a perceived or real risk to public health. Okay, and certainly, yes, there was at least a perceived, if not real risk to public health posed by the breaches of physical distancing that we were seeing. We also did consider the precautionary principle, which states that if there is a perceived material risk to public health, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing measures to prevent, control or abate that risk. And very importantly, that in the application of this principle, decision-making and action should be proportionate to the degree of public health risk and should be guided by paying special attention to number C, and aim to ensure minimum disruption to an individual's activities, community's functioning and commercial activity consistent with providing any necessary protection from identified public health risk. Okay, so considering this, we did seek advice from the LGA, Local Government Authority, regarding enforcement. At the time of the complaints, the incidence of COVID-19 in SA was very low, less than 5 active cases. So even though the community's perception was that the risk of COVID-19 was high, the actual risk posed to public health was quite low. With that in mind, the LGA advised us that because of this, it would be difficult to justify a public health notice under the Act. As I mentioned earlier, the proprietor had already taken some additional COVID-safe measures and was reluctant to take further steps, especially those that would hamper business, which I could understand. So it was a matter of trying to impress upon the proprietor the importance of physical distancing and encourage him to take the additional measures. I worked with the proprietor over several meetings and phone calls to determine the necessary steps his business should take to allow for and encourage physical distancing at his business that both us as a regulator and the business thought were reasonable. These were steps like managing the queue so that members of the public can use the footpath and physically distance from the patrons of the business, and rearrange indoor and outdoor seating such that separate groups are able to uphold that physical distancing principle. The outcome we've seen has been quite positive. When the business manages the queue well, the congestion is reduced and people are able to physically distance, and we receive far fewer complaints. So where are we now? Basically, we're at business as usual, but with a COVID-19 lens. For instance, when we conduct our normal food safety inspections, as was mentioned earlier, we would also confirm that businesses that are required to have a COVID safe plan and or a COVID marshal do have those. And we're seeing a lot more complacency in the community now, so it's about reminding businesses of their requirements. Important to note that whilst we were learning how to become and undertaking the role of physical distancing officers as EHOs, we also had to balance this with maintaining our original duties, because even during the height of the COVID outbreaks in South Australia, the risk of Legionella, Listeria, squalor, etc. all still continued and had to be managed. I've been told that this has been a very, very unique time for EHOs and that the role has changed dramatically. And whilst that's true for most EHOs, environmental health with COVID is all that I know. And perhaps the role of the EHO is now changed forever. We will have to wait and see. Thank you for your time and the opportunity.
I just wanted to say thank you and welcome to the EHO family. During time, you guys have done an excellent job, and you have highlighted the vital role that EHOs did play during COVID-19, and we saw that EHOs were the ones that were doing the education with food businesses about the emergency directions, and that naturally that role to EHOs. And I'm really proud of our profession for being agile and being able to adapt during COVID-19 and to step up and show other government authorities that we are here and that we do know what we're doing. So you certainly played a massive role in that, and thank you for doing that here in South Australia. We have a question for you. What advice would you give to new EHOs starting out in a post-COVID world? Great question.
So I'd probably say there'd be quite a bit of advice. But importantly, with the risk of COVID constantly fluctuating as it has, and I mentioned that the directions change all the time, it's meant that our rule book is also constantly changing. So it's really important to keep very up to date with the current directions and advice so that you can provide what's really current to the community and so that it's accurate. And I'd also warn that you could come across highly anxious and upset people in the community, understandably. It's been a very challenging time. And if you have a negative experience, to try not to take it personally or let it dishearten you. We do really important work, and just to carry on.
Great advice, Alysha. I think we can all, whether we're new or older in the profession, certainly listen to that. We've got another question here. You mentioned that other officers were authorised to perform COVID compliance checks. Why was this done and how was it delegated?
Yeah, so this was something that our constituent councils decided to go ahead with in conjunction with our organisation. I don't think it was statewide though. So the head of our organisation provided the delegated authority to general inspectors and other local government officers to perform compliance checks and issue written notices under the Act, but they didn't have the authority to issue oral emergency notices. So that was the main difference. But what it did mean was that we had additional officers performing compliance checks, which meant that we had greater reach in the community, which was obviously of great benefit at that time when time was really crucial and we had to get across the community as quickly as possible.
Absolutely, and I can also vouch for that we need a lot of boots on the ground, and general inspectors were used for that, and I think that was a really great idea, and it was across the board. So yeah, that's excellent. I don't know if we have any more questions. I don't think so. If not, Alysha, like I said, welcome. Thank you for sharing your story with us today and the great work that EHOs have done and continue to do during COVID and how that might change our work in the future. It's great that you could share that with us. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity, Helen.
Thanks. Okay, guys, thanks for hanging in there with us today. It's been fantastic. I'm now introducing our last speaker, Freddy Sunny, to our World Environmental Health Day live chat. So, Freddy, we welcome you to the screen with us today, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my, yes. So today I'm speaking about COVID-19, food security, and Indigenous communities. Before starting, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I now stand and recognize that these have been always a place of teaching and learning. I wish to pay respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the important role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people continue to play with our community and more broadly across Australia. We acknowledge the honor to be here among this great culture and learn and take responsibility, and hence belong to reflect that for at least 65,000 years, these custodians sustained health and life all over this continent of extremes through intimate knowledge of the Australian environment. So I would like to share two definitions. So one is on food system. A food system encompasses all the stages of keeping us fed, growing, harvesting, packaging, processing, transforming and marketing and consuming and disposing of food. So if any of these break, it will affect our food security. So the World Health Organization definition for food security is: food security exists when safe food is physically and economically available, accessible and affordable to all the people every time, which meet their dietary needs and cultural preferences and leads to a healthy and prosperous life. So according to World Health Organization, 20% of all global deaths are caused due to infectious communicable diseases. Out of this 20%, 50% of the top 5 killer diseases are zoonotic in origin. In the last 20 years, the world has witnessed many pandemics that are zoonotic in origin. This includes SARS, Nipah, Ebola, and now the COVID-19 have emerged from animal to human interactions in the food system. So this picture clearly gives an idea of how zoonotic diseases are transmitted. So basically, zoonotic diseases are infectious diseases caused by a pathogen, an infectious agent such as a bacterium, virus, parasite, or prion that has jumped from a non-human animal, usually a vertebrate, to a human. So food safety and pandemic. Consumption of poor quality food which is contaminated or host a pathogen can cause zoonotic diseases. These are due to mainly two reasons. One is lack of monitoring and enforcement by government authorities in food quality and safety standards. The second is unscientific storage of animals in poor standards and hygiene, poor handling, mutation of viral strains during wildlife trade, and finally, cross-species contamination. COVID-19 is mainly due to the transmission from humans to humans in urban society, increase in global trade and transport, and finally, the increase of antimicrobial resistance among our community. This coronavirus has moved to a pandemic level. The main reason for this is the virus jumping from animals to humans, and this is mainly due to human behaviors. I would like to share some case scenarios of Nipah virus, Ebola, SARS, and COVID. Improper sanitation and hygiene practices while handling animals and their product has been identified as the reason for cross-species transmission. The emergence of the Nipah virus in Malaysia has been linked with contamination of swine fed with saliva and feces of bats. Same was with Ebola. Direct contact with infected wildlife carcasses without safety equipment led to the emergence of Ebola. And SARS and COVID is also associated with animal-human interactions by transmission of virus strain. So this image shows 2 weeks back how the number of cases increasing all over the world. The reason for poor food safety is westernization of diets and increased demand of diverse food items led to increase in production of livestock and other agricultural products. Being Asia as the largest producer of livestock, lack of sanitation and other hygiene practices are identified as the cause of emergence of diseases such as swine flu, avian flu, and hoof and mouth disease, which affects pig, chicken, and cows. As an example, looking back to the highly contagious strain of avian virus in Thailand and in Vietnam, poor quality living standards, overcrowded chicken farms are identified as the cause. And the last reason is excessive use of antibiotics. Antibiotics used to increase the herd immunity in livestock led to increase in antimicrobial resistance among humans. This is mainly due to direct consumption of livestock products or indirect contact during production. Climate change in food security. Apart from all these reasons, climate change has a lot to do with food safety and security. So one is the agriculture productions depend on the balance of natural resources, that is the extremity of the weather. Second reason is climate change can lead to reduced harvest. Third reason is climate change. The land temperature are rising globally and predicted to do so with the current emission rates. And finally, climate change causes ocean acidification, leading to coral bleaching and reduction of marine life and seafood for consumption. Food supply is another issue we face during a pandemic. So we all know that Australia is capable of producing enough food for 75 million people. That is 3 times its own population. While our food supply is considered secure, shutdown measures and transport restrictions put in place to contain COVID-19 and have serious implications for food security. So primary production. Labor shortages are immediate problem during a crisis. Continent-wide lockdown can prevent seasonal harvest from traveling, which can lead to fields of abandoned rotting crops. As well as an active workforce, primary producers need essential resources like fertilizers, seeds, and veterinary medicines, and any shortage can affect future agricultural production. If proper farming practices can't continue as normal, this could lead to reduced harvest in later seasons. Then comes the transportation and warehousing. The safe and uninterrupted transportation of fresh produce, meat, and seafood is critical in the food supply chain. A shortage of truck drivers means that products cannot leave the farm, while transport delays are of particular concerns for live animals, transport, and meat supply due to animal welfare issues and food spoilage. And if these two are interrupted, the wholesale and retail of the trade will be impacted. Moving to food safety and security in Indigenous communities during COVID-19. So there are a lot of existing community factors, and history makes the Indigenous communities vulnerable. Biological contamination of food can occur from infected individuals. Contamination can also occur from surfaces such as cooking equipment, tableware, chopping boards, and food preparation areas. Then comes bulk buying food can lead to consumption of outdated food. Lack of infrastructure and inadequate refrigeration can lead to foodborne illnesses in remote Indigenous communities. In many Indigenous communities, there is only a single store, which increases the price, and the difficulty of transport and increase in price affects the food security. This leads to community income diminished due to lockdown, and which further leads to food insecurity, decreased nutritional status. Moving on to recommendations, basic hygiene practices, cleansing and sanitizing, appropriate storage of food. These are the basic, recommendations. Then comes purchased food items without defects, check best before and use by date before consumption, sustainable food production within communities, shorter food supply chains, adopt agricultural practices that promote biodiversity, improve soil and water quality, financial assistance for sustainable solutions, government policies to support the hungry communities, online sales connect farmers directly to buyers, and innovative storage, packaging, and supply of food. That's it. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I was really concentrating on your slides there. I found them very interesting, and talking to us about zoonotic disease transmission and climate change and food supply, and also how that applies to the already on top of the risks that Indigenous communities already face now. So it's thank you for bringing that to our attention and for reminding us of those points. So some questions for Freddy. Why are Indigenous Australians in remote areas food cure, and how can it be managed?
So let's take, I'm from Queensland, I'm from Brisbane. So let's take about Torres Strait Islands. So already we have issues of transport, the freight cost, and the harsh shelf life. All these are, leading to food insecurity in Torres Straits. So apart from all these, the COVID had led to, lockdowns and supply chains, affected supply chains. So it affects food security and food safety, and at the end they will be food insecure. So we need to plan ahead, or we need to prepare ourselves to tackle these kind of pandemics or emergency disasters.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. Is there any association between climate change and COVID-19?
I was trying to find out some information on the association between climate change and COVID-19, but we don't have any published literatures from all over the world which gives a connection between climate change and COVID-19. But there are some other factors which I would like to share from some reputed universities and from reputed journals. When the temperature increases, the animals move towards the poles. So this will lead to, linking or, coming across of new viruses with human beings. So this can lead to new diseases or new infectious or emerging infectious diseases.
Yes.
So yeah, and second thing is pollution and respiratory associated diseases. So these kind of situations will lead to more death among. So climate change has an association to pollution and respiratory diseases. So people who have respiratory diseases are more prone to death or more prone to illness. So that's what SARS, MERS, and now COVID says to or shows to us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Freddy. That's fantastic. You've been great, and we really appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge with us for us to think further about the food security issue. That's excellent.
Thank you so much.
Well, to my environmental health professional friends and family across the nation, this now concludes our World Environmental Health Day live chat for this year. So I hope everyone has enjoyed it as much as I have. Another positive, I guess, of the pandemic that we've lived through is that we have been able to connect a lot more with each other interstate and internationally, and that's given us the opportunity to provide this live chat for all of you today. I want to take the opportunity to again thank our amazing speakers that we've had take part in our live chat today. They've shared their knowledge and experience with us. I'm sure we've all learned something new, and I'm sure it's taken, it will leave with us questions to ponder in the future and to keep talking about these issues with each other. A recording of this chat will be made available via the EHA website in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye out on the EHA social media channels for that announcement. I also want to encourage everyone to have a look at the EHA YouTube channel tomorrow morning. EHA will be releasing a special World Environmental Health Day edition of our newly launched Who Are EHO video series. And some of today's speakers will be featured as guests on that. So do keep your eye out for that. A link to the EHA YouTube page was on the screen. Lastly, if you'd like more information about environmental health, EHOs or EHA, visit the Environmental Health Australia website by following the link on your screen that you can see now. So everyone, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. It's been a fantastic couple hours that we have spent together. Let's support each other, let's share our stories, and let's learn and be prepared for whatever lies ahead, because we are EHOs, we're passionate about what we do, and we like to help our communities. So again, thank you everyone. It's been great to have you all on board, and we will be in touch in the future.